A wooden training dummy stands silent in a Hong Kong studio. The windows are dark. On a nearby desk sits an unfinished script titled Game of Death. The ink on the final page is still wet. Was Bruce Lee a martial artist who happened to make movies, or a philosopher who used fighting to ask harder questions? In a life compressed to 32 years, the collision between ancient discipline and modern spectacle reshaped how millions saw strength, identity, and what the body could express. One choice, one consequence, one reckoning. In 1973, a doctor examines Lee's skull and finds swelling that shouldn't exist. In 1964, a martial artist challenges Lee to a private fight that will haunt him for years. In 1940, a newborn arrives during the Year of the Dragon, in the Hour of the Dragon, and his father, a Cantonese opera star, names him Lee Jun-fan, meaning return again. Supporters point to his films as acts of cultural defiance. Critics argue he commodified tradition for Western consumption. In the next hour, 3 turning points will define who Bruce Lee was: his decision to teach non-Chinese students in 1964, his walkout from Hollywood in 1971, and his final film, shot while his body was already failing. We'll follow the contracts, the medical records, and the testimonies of those who trained beside him. But first, before the story accelerates, a smaller question. Why did Lee's mother register his birth under a girl's name? November 27, 1940. Grace Lee gives birth at the Chinese hospital in San Francisco. Her husband is touring America with a Cantonese opera troupe. The midwife writes Lee Jun-fan in the ledger, but Grace adds a second name to the American paperwork, Bruce. She also lists the infant's sex as female. The reasoning is not sentiment. In Cantonese folklore, demons steal boys. Recording a son as a daughter might confuse malicious spirits long enough for the child to grow strong. 3 months later, the Lee family boards a ship back to Hong Kong. Bruce Lee spends his infancy as a child with 2 names, 2 citizenships, and a family balanced between Confucian ritual and backstage pragmatism. His father, Lee Hoi-chuen, is a respected actor in Cantonese opera, a form blending acrobatics, percussion, and stylized combat. The family lives near Kowloon, in a cramped apartment shared with extended relatives. Money is inconsistent. Status is borrowed from the stage. Grace Lee manages the household with unsentimental efficiency. She is protective, but not soft. According to biographer Matthew Polly, she once told young Bruce that if he didn't study harder, he would end up a nobody. Bruce is the 4th of 5 children. He is small, nearsighted, and perpetually restless. By age 6, he appears in his first film as a child actor, coached by his father through simple scenes. The camera doesn't intimidate him. But Hong Kong in the 1940s is a city under occupation. Japanese forces control the streets, food is rationed, schools close and reopen erratically. The Lee family survives through opera connections and Grace's ability to navigate black markets. When the war ends in 1945, the British return. The city rebuilds, but stability doesn't follow. Street gangs multiply. Turf wars decide who controls which blocks. Bruce, now a wiry teenager, drifts toward trouble. He joins a gang called the Tigers. He carries a small knife. He gets into fistfights over minor slights. Grace worries he'll be killed or arrested before he turns 18. In 1954, she makes a decision. She enrolls Bruce in martial arts lessons under Yip Man, a Wing Chun master who teaches in a narrow studio above a restaurant. The goal is not enlightenment, it's survival. Wing Chun emphasizes efficiency, no wasted motion, close-range strikes, sensitivity to an opponent's energy. Yip Man is quiet, patient, and uninterested in spectacle. His students practice on wooden dummies for hours. Bruce, accustomed to quick results, finds the repetition maddening. But something holds. He begins training 6 days a week. He challenges classmates to Chi Sao sparring sessions. He studies the angles. He asks Yip Man why certain techniques exist and what happens if you remove them. Yip Man doesn't answer all the questions. He tells Bruce to keep practicing. The apprenticeship lasts roughly 4 years. During that time, Bruce continues acting in Hong Kong films, often as a troubled youth or a gang member. He is typecast as himself. In 1958, Bruce gets into a rooftop fight with the son of a powerful family. The details are disputed, but the outcome is clear. Grace Lee decides her son needs to leave Hong Kong before someone retaliates. She books him a one-way ticket to San Francisco. He is 18 years old, fluent in Cantonese and broken English, and carrying $80 in cash. The question she doesn't ask aloud: will distance calm him down or give him room to become something worse? April 1959. Bruce Lee arrives in San Francisco with a suitcase and the legal status of an American citizen thanks to his birth certificate. He moves in with family, friends, and enrolls at Edison Technical School to finish his high school diploma. He works as a dishwasher, a waiter, a dance instructor. He teaches cha-cha steps to housewives in church basements. The work is tedious, but it pays. He saves methodically. At night, he practices Wing Chun alone in cramped apartments. He writes letters to Yip Man, asking for clarifications on technique. Most go unanswered. He begins to suspect that asking too many questions annoyed his teacher. In 1960, Lee enrolls at the University of Washington in Seattle. He declares a major in philosophy. His English improves. He reads Krishnamurti, Alan Watts, and Lao Tzu. He underlines passages about adaptability and the dangers of rigid systems. He also begins teaching martial arts informally, at first to classmates in parking lots, then in rented spaces. He calls his approach Yun Fan Gung Fu, using his Chinese name. The classes are small. The students are mostly white. This is unusual. Traditional Chinese martial arts schools in America operate under an unwritten rule. Chinese techniques are taught to Chinese students. Outsiders are tolerated in beginner classes, but rarely admitted to advanced training. The logic is both cultural and economic. Knowledge is a family asset, not a public resource. Lee ignores the rule. He teaches anyone willing to pay the fee and commit to the work. He demonstrates on students, regardless of their background. This decision will have consequences. In 1963, Lee meets Linda Emery, a white college student who enrolls in his classes. She is 19, he is 22. They marry the following year in a small ceremony. Her parents are civil, but uneasy. His mother, upon hearing the news by letter, expresses quiet disappointment. The marriage complicates Lee's standing in Seattle's Chinese community. Some view it as assimilation. Others see it as pragmatism. Linda is educated, organized, and willing to manage the administrative side of his teaching. By 1964, Lee's reputation as an instructor is growing. He opens a formal school called the Jun Fan Gung Fu Institute. His students include judokas, karate practitioners, and street fighters curious about Wing Chun's directness. Then, in the summer of 1964, a martial artist named Wong Jackman issues a challenge. The specifics are contested, but the general outline is agreed upon. Wong, representing traditional Chinese martial arts schools in the Bay Area, objects to Lee teaching non-Chinese students. A private match is arranged to settle the dispute. The fight takes place in Oakland, in Lee's school, with a small audience of witnesses. It lasts somewhere between 3 and 25 minutes, depending on who tells the story. Lee wins, but not cleanly. He is winded, his hands hurt. Wong retreats, but disputes the outcome publicly. Lee is shaken. He expected to dominate. Instead, he struggled against an opponent he considered inferior. According to multiple accounts, he spends the following weeks obsessing over what went wrong. He concludes that Wing Chun, for all its elegance, is incomplete. It excels at close range, but falters when distance opens. It prizes structure, but resists adaptation. Lee begins experimenting, adding Western boxing footwork, fencing techniques, grappling holds. His students notice the shift. Some are excited, others feel betrayed. One senior student, James Yim Lee, encourages the evolution. Another, Taki Kimura, urges caution. Linda later recalls this period as one of relentless self-questioning. Bruce fills notebooks with sketches of fighting stances, leverage points, and timing diagrams. He watches boxing matches on television and dissects footwork frame by frame. The Wong Jackman fight does not destroy Lee's reputation, but it exposes a gap between his confidence and his ability, and forces him to choose between refining what he knows and discarding it entirely. The choice he makes will define everything that follows. 1966. A television producer named William Dozier watches a demonstration at a martial arts tournament in Long Beach, California. Bruce Lee performs a series of strikes so fast, the cameraman struggles to track them. Dozier sees potential, not as a fighter, but as a performer. He offers Lee a screen test. The result is a role in a television series called The Green Hornet. Lee plays Kato, the Hornet's sidekick and chauffeur. The character speaks fewer than 10 lines per episode. His primary function is to disable henchmen using martial arts, while the Hornet delivers the heroic dialogue. The show premieres in September 1966. It runs for 1 season, 26 episodes, and is cancelled due to low ratings. Critics praise Lee's physicality. Audiences are intrigued but not captivated. The Hornet himself is bland. Lee hoped the role would open doors. Instead, it typecasts him. Casting directors now see him as the martial arts guy, useful for action sequences, unsuitable for leading roles. He auditions for multiple projects. He is rejected, often without explanation. Years later, producers would admit the obstacle. American television in the 1960s was not ready to center an Asian man as a romantic or dramatic lead. Studios feared alienating white audiences in southern markets. Lee is offered small parts, waiters, henchmen, houseboys. He declines most of them. He returns to teaching martial arts full-time, expanding his system. He officially names it Jeet Kune Do, meaning the way of the intercepting fist. The philosophy is simple. Absorb what is useful, discard what is not, add what is uniquely your own. He opens a second school in Los Angeles. His students now include Hollywood stunt coordinators, screenwriters, and actors. People with access, but no authority. One student, screenwriter Sterling Siliphant, becomes a close friend and occasional collaborator. In 1969, Lee pitches an idea to Warner Brothers, a television series about a Shaolin monk wandering the American West, using martial arts to resolve conflicts without killing. He envisions the show as a vehicle for philosophical dialogue wrapped in action. The pitch is well received. Executives express interest. Meetings are scheduled. Lee begins training for the role. He believes this is his breakthrough. Then, in 1971, Warner Brothers announces the series Kung Fu, starring David Carradine, a white actor with no martial arts background. The network explains that Carradine is more accessible to mainstream audiences. Lee is not offered even a supporting role. The betrayal is public. Entertainment journalists report the casting as routine. Lee's name is mentioned in passing as the original consultant. He is asked for comment. He declines. Linda later describes this period as the lowest point in their marriage. Bruce becomes withdrawn. He trains obsessively, sometimes for 6 hours a day. He experiments with electrical muscle stimulation, isometric exercises, and strict diets. He is searching for control over something. But the rejection also clarifies a choice. Hollywood will not make space for him. He will have to create his own. In late 1971, Lee receives an offer from a Hong Kong producer named Raymond Chow. The proposal: star in a low-budget martial arts film aimed at Southeast Asian audiences. The pay is modest. The creative control is partial. The genre is considered disposable. Lee accepts. He books a flight to Hong Kong. He tells Linda he'll be gone for 3 months. The question he doesn't voice: what happens if this fails too? 1971. Bruce Lee steps off the plane in Hong Kong and is surprised by the crowd. Fans recognize him from reruns of The Green Hornet, which has become unexpectedly popular across Asia. He is not famous in America, but here, people stop him on the street. Raymond Chow's production company, Golden Harvest, operates on tight budgets and tighter schedules. The film Lee has agreed to make is called The Big Boss. The script is formulaic. A rural worker moves to the city, discovers his employer is running a drug operation, and fights back. The director is Lo Wei, a veteran of Mandarin cinema who resents taking notes from actors. Lee and Lo Wei clash immediately. Lee wants to choreograph his own fights. He argues that traditional martial arts scenes where combatants pause between exchanges look staged. He wants continuous motion, realistic impact, minimal cuts. Lo Wei insists on following the established style. Audiences expect it. Lee threatens to walk off set. Chow mediates. A compromise is reached. Lee choreographs his scenes, but Lo Wei directs everything else. The Big Boss is shot in 6 weeks on location in Thailand. The budget is so constrained that some fight scenes are filmed in single takes to save film stock. Lee's frustration becomes fuel. He moves faster than the camera crew expects. Stunt performers are injured during rehearsals. Lee adjusts techniques on the fly to avoid seriously hurting anyone, but the intensity is visible. The film is released in October 1971. It breaks box office records across Asia. Audiences are electrified. Lee's fighting style is unlike anything in previous martial arts films. No theatrical flourishes, no prolonged stances, just speed, efficiency, and audible impact. Chow immediately offers Lee a second film. This time, Lee negotiates for more control. The result is Fist of Fury, released in March 1972. The plot involves a martial arts student avenging his teacher's murder. The film includes a scene where Lee's character destroys a sign reading, "No dogs and Chinese allowed." The scene resonates. Hong Kong in the 1970s is a British colony where wealth and opportunity are stratified along racial lines. The image of Lee, small, wiry, unflinching, kicking through a symbol of colonial humiliation becomes iconic. Audiences cheer. Some theatres report viewers standing and applauding mid-screening. Fist of Fury outperforms The Big Boss. Lee is now the highest-paid actor in Hong Kong cinema. He is 29 years old. But success intensifies the friction with Lo Wei. Lee wants full creative control. He wants to direct, write, and choreograph. Lo Wei views this as arrogance. The relationship disintegrates. Lee decides to form his own production company with Raymond Chow. They call it Concord Productions. Lee writes, directs, and stars in The Way of the Dragon, released in June 1972. The film is set in Rome. Lee plays a martial artist sent to protect a Chinese restaurant from gangsters. The climax is a fight in the Colosseum against an American karate champion played by Chuck Norris. The Colosseum fight lasts 11 minutes. It is shot with minimal dialogue. The choreography emphasizes contrast. Lee's fluid adaptability against Norris's rigid power. The scene becomes one of the most analyzed sequences in martial arts cinema. The Way of the Dragon becomes the highest-grossing film in Hong Kong history. Lee's face is on magazine covers, billboards, and bootleg posters across Asia. He is invited to talk shows. He is asked about philosophy, training, diet, and whether he can really move as fast as he appears on screen. He can. Warner Brothers notices. The studio that rejected him for Kung Fu now offers him a co-production deal. a Hollywood-backed martial arts film with a real budget. The project is called Enter the Dragon. Lee sees the opportunity and the trap. Hollywood is offering partnership, not control. The script is written by Americans. The director, Robert Klaus, has never made a martial arts film. The studio retains final cut. Lee negotiates relentlessly. He demands the right to choreograph all fight scenes. He insists on casting his own supporting actors. He refuses scenes that depict Asian characters as subservient or exotic for Western amusement. The studio agrees to most terms, not out of respect, but because Lee's Asian box office value is now undeniable. Filming begins in January 1973. The production is troubled. Lee argues with Klaus over pacing. He rejects takes that he believes make him look weak. He works 14-hour days, then trains alone at night. His body begins to show strain. He loses weight. He complains of back pain. Friends notice he is exhausted. Linda urges him to slow down. He refuses. Enter the Dragon is his chance to prove that an Asian actor can carry a Hollywood film. The question he doesn't ask: at what cost? March 1973. Bruce Lee is filming inserts for Enter the Dragon at Golden Harvest Studios in Hong Kong. Between takes, he collapses. The crew calls a doctor. Lee regains consciousness but is disoriented. He is taken to a hospital. The diagnosis is cerebral edema, swelling of the brain. Doctors can't identify the cause. They prescribe mannitol to reduce the swelling. Lee is released after 2 days. He is advised to rest. He ignores the advice. Enter the Dragon wraps in April. Lee immediately begins pre-production on Game of Death, a film he's been conceptualizing for months. The premise: a martial artist must ascend a 5-story pagoda, facing a different fighting style on each level. The final opponent, played by basketball star Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, is over 7 feet tall. Lee wants to explore how a smaller fighter adapts to overwhelming size. The concept is ambitious. Lee plans to shoot the fights in long, unbroken takes. He designs the pagoda set himself. He writes detailed notes on each opponent's strategy and weakness. But the production is underfunded. Lee is financing parts of it personally. The schedule is chaotic. He films sporadically while managing promotional obligations for Enter the Dragon, which is set to release in August. On May 10th, 1973, Lee records a series of Cantonese language overdubs for Enter the Dragon in a poorly ventilated studio. The heat is oppressive. He removes his shirt. He complains of a headache, but continues working. At one point, he tells a colleague he feels dizzy. He sits down. He stands up. He finishes the session. Later, friends would describe this period as one of compounding stresses: financial pressure from self-funding Game of Death, physical exhaustion from constant training, and the psychological weight of knowing that Enter the Dragon would determine whether Hollywood would give him another chance. Linda later tells biographers that Bruce became fixated on legacy during these months. He talked about opening a chain of martial arts schools. He outlined plans for future films, exploring different philosophies. He spoke about writing a book on Jeet Kune Do, though he worried that codifying his system would contradict its core principle of adaptability. On July 20th, 1973, Lee visits the apartment of actress Betty Ting Pei to discuss a script for Game of Death. Another collaborator, Raymond Chow, is present. Around mid-afternoon, Lee complains of a headache. Ting Pei offers him a prescription painkiller called Equigesic, which contains aspirin and a muscle relaxant. Lee takes 1 tablet and lies down to rest. He does not wake up. Chow attempts to rouse him around 7:30 in the evening. He cannot. An ambulance is called. Lee is rushed to Queen Elizabeth Hospital. Doctors attempt resuscitation. He is pronounced dead at 11 p.m. The official cause, determined after weeks of investigation, is cerebral edema, the same condition that caused his collapse in May. The coroner rules the death as death by misadventure, attributing it to a hypersensitivity reaction to the equigesic tablet. Some medical experts question the conclusion, noting that cerebral edema of this severity typically has an underlying cause. Alternate theories emerge. Some suggest an undiagnosed congenital condition. Others point to his use of muscle stimulators, strict diets, and intense training as potential factors. Still, others raise questions about the circumstances of his death, why he was at Ting Pei's apartment, why Chow delayed calling the ambulance. The Hong Kong press publishes conflicting reports. Rumors spread. Lee's family requests privacy. The funeral is held in Hong Kong, followed by a second service in Seattle, where he is buried at Lakeview Cemetery. Enter the Dragon is released 3 weeks later. It becomes the highest-grossing martial arts film ever made. Lee is 32 years old at the time of his death. He leaves behind Linda, his 2 children, Brandon and Shannon, and an unfinished film. The question that haunts those who knew him, was this an accident, or the inevitable result of a body pushed beyond sustainable limits? To understand what Bruce Lee's films did, it helps to understand what came before. Martial arts cinema in the 1960s followed a template inherited from Peking opera: stylized choreography, exaggerated sound effects, and combatants who pause between exchanges to reset for the next sequence. Fights were theatrical, not visceral. Lee's approach was different. He insisted on filming strikes at full speed. He positioned cameras to capture the extension and retraction of punches, not just the moment of contact. He used close-ups to show facial reactions, pain, surprise, determination. He recorded impact sounds separately and layered them in post-production to match the rhythm of each fight. The effect was subtle but transformative. Audiences felt the difference even if they couldn't articulate it. Fights in Lee's films looked effortful. Bodies collided with weight. Combatants breathed hard. Sweat was visible. This realism had philosophical roots. Lee believed that martial arts on film should reflect martial arts in practice, efficient, adaptive, and grounded in physics. He often quoted a principle from Jeet Kune Do: simplicity is the height of cultivation. If a technique required theatrical setup, it was removed. But Lee's films were not documentaries. They were fantasies calibrated to feel plausible. The enemies were numerous but defeatable. The protagonist was outnumbered but never outmatched. The violence was frequent but contained, brutal without being graphic. This balance made the films accessible. Viewers in Hong Kong, Manila, Lagos, and Sao Paulo saw themselves in Lee's characters, not because they looked like him, but because he depicted struggle without invincibility. He got hit. He bled. He adapted. The cultural resonance was immediate. In post-colonial Asia, Lee's image, small, non-white, defeating larger opponents, became a metaphor. In Black American communities, his films were embraced as allegories of resistance. In working-class neighborhoods worldwide, his success story, immigrant, self-taught, rejected by Hollywood, was read as validation. But there was a tension. Lee was performing Chinese martial arts for global audiences, many of whom had no context for the traditions he was drawing from. Some Chinese martial artists argued that his films simplified and distorted centuries-old practices. Others accused him of selling out by tailoring his performances for Western consumption. Lee was aware of the criticism. In interviews, he defended his choices by distinguishing between classical martial arts and functional martial arts. He argued that tradition, while valuable, could become dogma. He believed that clinging to outdated techniques dishonored the original purpose of martial arts, which was practical self-defense. This position alienated traditionalists. It also made him a target. In Hong Kong, rival martial arts schools began challenging him publicly. Some sent students to his demonstrations to heckle. Others spread rumors that his fighting ability was exaggerated that his speed was created through film editing. Lee responded by increasing the intensity of his demonstrations. At public events, he performed 2-finger push-ups, 1-inch punches that knocked opponents backward, and strikes so fast that observers claimed they couldn't track the motion. These displays were carefully staged, but they served a purpose. They reinforced the idea that his film performances were grounded in real ability. The pressure to prove himself physically never subsided. Friends recall Lee training obsessively, sometimes waking at dawn to run, then spending hours on technique drills, then lifting weights, then sparring. He documented his routines in notebooks, tracking his progress with the precision of an engineer. This relentless self-improvement had costs. By 1973, Lee's body fat percentage was in the single digits. His back pain, caused by a weight training injury years earlier, worsened. He relied on muscle relaxants and analgesics to manage discomfort. He ignored medical advice to rest. The paradox of Lee's life was that his films celebrated the wisdom of adaptability, but his personal approach to training was rigid. He pushed his body as if it were a machine that could be optimized indefinitely. He did not account for limits. The result was a body that looked invincible on screen, but was quietly failing off it. Bruce Lee's teaching career is less mythologized than his film work, but it reveals a clearer picture of how he thought. Between 1964 and 1973, he trained hundreds of students, many of whom kept detailed notes. These notes, now archived and published, show a teacher who was patient with beginners, but ruthless with advanced students. Lee's pedagogy was Socratic. He rarely demonstrated a technique and declared it correct. Instead, he asked questions. Why does this work? What happens if your opponent moves left? Can you simplify this by 2 steps? He wanted students to think, not imitate. One former student, Dan Inosanto, later recalled that Lee would sometimes teach contradictory techniques in consecutive sessions. When challenged, Lee would explain that the goal was not to master specific moves, but to develop the ability to choose the right tool for a given situation. He called this style without style. But Lee's teaching was also shaped by hierarchy. He had inner circle students, James Yim Lee, Taki Kimura, Dan Inosanto, who received advanced instruction. Casual students were taught basics and encouraged to explore other systems. Lee believed that not everyone needed or deserved his full attention. This selectivity created resentment. Some students felt dismissed. Others accused Lee of favoritism. One student, who trained briefly in the late 1960s, later wrote that Lee's classes felt like auditions and you were constantly being evaluated to determine if you were worth the investment. Lee did not apologize for this approach. He believed that serious students revealed themselves through effort. If you showed up inconsistently or asked shallow questions, you were not ready. If you challenged him thoughtfully or demonstrated genuine curiosity, he invested time. The tension between accessibility and elitism ran through everything Lee did. He opened his schools to non-Chinese students, which was radical, but he also charged fees that excluded working-class practitioners. He spoke publicly about breaking down barriers between martial arts styles, but he privately dismissed many traditional schools as outdated. This contradiction was central to his philosophy. He genuinely believed in meritocracy, that skill and dedication should override background. But he also believed that most people lacked the discipline to develop real skill. He wanted to democratize martial arts, but he didn't believe everyone deserved equal access to his knowledge. In 1971, Lee stopped teaching regular classes. The demands of filmmaking made it impossible, but he continued working privately with a small group of students, including Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and actor James Coburn. These sessions were less about technique and more about philosophy. Lee assigned readings from Taoism, Zen Buddhism, and Western existentialism. He framed martial arts as applied philosophy. a way to test ideas about adaptability, ego, and presence. Coburn later described these sessions as informal seminars. Lee would spar lightly, then pause to discuss why a certain move worked. He drew diagrams on napkins. He quoted Krishnamurti and Bruce Lee in the same breath, sometimes without distinguishing between them. But Lee's teaching was also transactional. He cultivated relationships with Hollywood figures not just out of interest but because he hoped they would help advance his career. He gave private lessons to producers, directors, and screenwriters. He knew these connections might lead to roles or funding. This pragmatism was not cynical, it was survival. Lee understood that talent alone would not break through Hollywood's barriers. He needed advocates. Teaching was one way to create them. The strategy worked. To a point. Sterling Siliphant, a screenwriter Lee trained, wrote roles for him in television projects. Steve McQueen, another student, publicly praised Lee's skill, raising his profile. But none of these connections could override the structural racism of the industry. By the time Lee returned to Hong Kong in 1971, he had largely stopped trying to convert Hollywood from within. He shifted his strategy, prove his value in Asia, then force Hollywood to meet his terms. The gamble succeeded. Enter the Dragon happened because Warner Brothers could not ignore the box office numbers from The Big Boss and Fist of Fury. But success came too late for Lee to capitalize on it. He died before Enter the Dragon was released. The question his students still debate: was Bruce Lee a teacher who wanted to preserve knowledge, or a strategist who used teaching to build leverage? Bruce Lee's philosophical writings are scattered across notebooks, letters, and recorded interviews. He never published a formal book. What remains is fragmentary but consistent. Three themes recur: the rejection of fixed systems, the primacy of direct experience, and the idea that self-knowledge requires confrontation. Lee's most quoted line, "Be water, my friend," comes from a 1971 television interview. The full passage is longer. Empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. You put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Water can flow, or it can crash. Be water, my friend. The metaphor is borrowed from Taoism, but Lee adapted it. In classical Taoist thought, water represents yielding and non-resistance. Lee's version emphasizes adaptability without passivity. Water doesn't just yield, it finds a way through. It shapes itself to circumstances, but retains its essential nature. This philosophy informed how Lee approached martial arts. He rejected the idea that any single style could address all situations. Wing Chun was excellent for close-range sensitivity, but limited at distance. Western boxing offered superior footwork, but lacked grappling answers. Judo excelled at throws, but ignored strikes. Lee's solution was to study all of them and synthesize principles, not techniques. He called this approach Jeet Kune Do, though he later expressed regret about naming it. He worried that once something is named, it becomes an institution. People start teaching Jeet Kune Do as if it were a fixed curriculum, which contradicts the core idea. Lee wanted a method of inquiry, not a style. But Lee's philosophy was not purely abstract. He tested it through sparring. He believed that ideas about combat meant nothing unless they worked under pressure. If a technique failed in practice, it was discarded. If a principle produced consistent results, it was retained. This empirical approach put Lee at odds with traditional martial arts culture, which often valued lineage and ritual over functionality. Some masters taught techniques that had been passed down for generations without questioning whether they still served a purpose. Lee viewed this as intellectual laziness. He argued that martial arts, like any discipline, must evolve or become irrelevant. But evolution requires humility. Lee's philosophy emphasized that the practitioner must remain a student, always testing, always refining. He warned against the trap of mastery, which he believed led to stagnation. In his notes he wrote, "To know oneself is to study oneself in action with another person." This principle extended beyond martial arts. Lee saw physical training as a laboratory for exploring ego, fear, and limitation. Sparring revealed when you were clinging to pride. Losing exposed where your technique was weak. Pain clarified what mattered. In this sense, martial arts was not about defeating others. It was about confronting yourself. But there was a darker edge to Lee's philosophy. He believed that most people avoided self-examination because it was uncomfortable. He had little patience for what he called organized despair, people who complained about their circumstances but refused to change. He saw discipline as the antidote to victimhood. This belief could be harsh. Friends recall Lee being dismissive of students who made excuses or who sought sympathy instead of solutions. He expected people to take responsibility for their outcomes, even when structural barriers existed. It was a philosophy shaped by his own experience. He had faced rejection and discrimination, but he believed his success proved that effort could overcome obstacle. The limitation of this view was that Lee underestimated how much luck and timing contributed to his success. He was in the right place when Hong Kong cinema was booming. He had American citizenship, which gave him mobility. He had a partner who managed logistics so he could focus on training. These advantages were not solely the result of discipline, but Lee's philosophy resonated because it offered agency. It told people that they could shape their lives through effort and adaptation. It was an optimistic message, even if it was incomplete. The question his writings leave unanswered: can you be water in a system designed to contain you? Bruce Lee's relationship with race was complicated. He was Chinese, raised in a British colony, fluent in Cantonese and English, and culturally positioned between multiple identities. His films made him a symbol of Asian pride, but his life revealed the limits of symbolic representation. In Hong Kong, Lee was both celebrated and scrutinized. Some viewed him as a success story, the local kid who conquered Hollywood. Others saw him as too westernized, too willing to perform for non-Chinese audiences. His marriage to Linda, a white American, was a frequent target of gossip. Some tabloids questioned whether he had abandoned Chinese culture. Lee responded to these criticisms inconsistently. In some interviews, he emphasized his Chinese heritage and described his mission as elevating Chinese martial arts on the global stage. In others, he framed himself as beyond nationality, a martial artist first, a Chinese second. He wanted to be seen as universal, but the world insisted on categorizing him. In America, the dynamic was different. Lee was often the only Asian person in the room. Casting directors saw him as ethnic flavor, not a leading man. Directors asked him to exaggerate his accent or perform choreographed bows. He refused most of these requests, which cost him roles. The rejection from Kung Fu crystallized the paradox. Hollywood wanted the cultural capital of martial arts, the mystique, the discipline, the exoticism, but not the burden of centering an Asian actor. David Carradine could play a Shaolin monk because he was white, which made him relatable. Lee's actual expertise and authenticity were liabilities. This double bind shaped how Lee approached his Hong Kong films. He knew that Western audiences consumed martial arts films as fantasies of the other, foreign, inscrutable, dangerous. But he also knew that Asian audiences saw his films as acts of reclamation. He was reclaiming the narrative that Hollywood had flattened. The result was a deliberate hybridity. Lee's films featured Chinese settings and themes, but were shot with techniques borrowed from Western action cinema. The soundtracks mixed traditional Chinese instruments with funk and rock. The plots were simple enough to cross language barriers, but included cultural references that rewarded local viewers. This strategy worked commercially, but it also opened Lee to accusations of inauthenticity from both sides. Traditional Chinese martial artists argued that his films distorted history and philosophy for mass appeal. Western critics sometimes dismissed his work as exploitation cinema, too shallow to be taken seriously. Lee was aware of these critiques, but he rejected the premise. He believed that culture was not static, that borrowing and synthesis were how traditions stayed alive. He saw himself as part of a lineage of Chinese innovators who adapted to changing circumstances. He did not believe that purity was a virtue. But this position required confidence that Lee did not always possess. Friends recall moments of doubt, particularly after the Kung Fu rejection. He questioned whether his success in Hong Kong was enough. He worried that history would remember him as a regional star who never broke through in the West. The irony is that Lee's global influence emerged posthumously. Enter the Dragon introduced him to audiences who had never seen his Hong Kong films. His philosophy, transmitted through interviews and writings, reached martial artists worldwide. His image became a template, the underdog who refuses to stay in his assigned place. But symbolic representation has limits. Lee opened doors, but he did not dismantle the structure. Asian actors after him still faced typecasting, still fought for leading roles, still navigated the expectation that they perform ethnicity in specific ways. Lee's success proved that one individual could transcend barriers, but it did not prove that the barriers had disappeared. The question his legacy raises: is representation progress, or just a better-dressed version of the same exclusion? Game of Death was supposed to be Bruce Lee's masterpiece. The concept was elegant. A martial artist ascends a 5-story pagoda, facing a different opponent on each level. Each opponent represents a different fighting philosophy. The protagonist must adapt to survive. The structure was metaphorical. The pagoda represented the hierarchy of mastery. Each level tested not just skill, but the ability to abandon preconceptions. The final opponent, played by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who stood 7 feet 2 inches, was designed to force the protagonist to fight, without relying on strength or reach. Lee shot approximately 40 minutes of footage for Game of Death between April and July 1973. The surviving material includes the fight sequences on the top 3 floors. The choreography is deliberate. Lee uses footwork, angles, and timing to neutralize Abdul-Jabbar's size advantage. The fight is less about spectacle and more about problem solving. But the film was never completed. Lee died before shooting the lower floors or any connective narrative. Golden Harvest shelved the project. In 1978, the studio revived Game of Death as a commercial release. Director Robert Klaus, who had worked on Enter the Dragon, was hired to construct a film around Lee's existing footage. The result was a patchwork. Klaus used body doubles, stand-ins, and unused clips from Lee's earlier films. He created a new plot involving a martial artist faking his own death to escape the mob. The 1978 version of Game of Death is widely regarded as exploitative. Lee's footage accounts for roughly 11 minutes of the 90-minute runtime. The rest is filler. The film trades on his image, but distorts his intent. The original concept, what Lee actually wanted to make, remains speculative. He left behind notes, sketches, and conversations recorded by collaborators. These fragments suggest that Game of Death was meant to be a philosophical treatise disguised as an action film. Each floor of the pagoda would explore a principle from Jeet Kune Do: directness, economy of motion, adaptability. Danny Nosanto, one of Lee's students who appeared in the original footage, later said that Lee saw Game of Death as his answer to the critics who claimed his philosophy was vague. The film would demonstrate, through action, what no way as way actually meant. But the project was also personal. Lee was exhausted by the commercial demands of Hong Kong cinema. He wanted to make something that would last, something that could stand alongside the films he admired, like Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai or Sergio Leone's westerns. He believed Game of Death could be that film. The question is whether he was right. The surviving footage is impressive, but it's incomplete. The fights are technically sophisticated, but without the narrative structure Lee envisioned, they're isolated set pieces. It's impossible to know if the finished film would have achieved what he hoped. What remains is a reminder of how much was lost. Lee died at a moment when he was transitioning from action star to filmmaker. He was beginning to exercise creative control. He was refining his ideas. He was learning how to translate philosophy into visual storytelling. Game of Death is not just an unfinished film. It's a glimpse of the work Lee might have done if he had lived longer. It raises the uncomfortable question: how much of his legacy is based on potential rather than completed achievement? Bruce Lee's death triggered a wave of exploitation. Within months, studios in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea began producing films with titles like Exit the Dragon, Enter the Tiger, and The Clones of Bruce Lee. Actors with similar builds were hired and billed as Bruce Lee, or Dragon Lee. The goal was to capitalize on those audiences who wanted more Bruce Lee content, even if it was counterfeit. These films were low budget and formulaic. The plots borrowed heavily from Lee's work. The fights mimicked his style. Rapid punches, high kicks, nunchaku sequences. But the imitations lacked the precision and intensity that made Lee's performances distinctive. What remained was spectacle without substance. Linda Lee, now a widow with 2 young children, fought to protect her husband's image. She challenged unauthorized biographies, rejected licensing deals that trivialized his philosophy, and carefully managed the release of archival footage. She understood that Bruce's legacy could easily be reduced to kitsch. But controlling a legacy is difficult when the person has become a global icon. By the late 1970s, Bruce Lee posters hung in gyms, bedrooms, and martial arts schools across 6 continents. His image appeared on lunchboxes, t-shirts, and trading cards. His face was appropriated by movements he never endorsed and philosophies he never articulated. The most significant misunderstanding involved his relationship to violence. Lee's films depicted physical conflict, but his philosophy emphasized restraint. He believed that the highest expression of martial arts was avoiding the fight altogether. In interviews, he often quoted Lao Tzu, "The best fighter is never angry." Yet his image became synonymous with aggression. This disconnect frustrated those who knew him. Danny Inosanto later said that people saw Bruce Lee as a fighter, but he was really a thinker who happened to be good at fighting. The films were vehicles for ideas, not celebrations of violence. But audiences extracted what they wanted, the action, and ignored the rest. The same dynamic occurred with his philosophy. Be water became a meme, stripped of context. People quoted it in motivational posts without understanding the Taoist roots or the years of practice required to embody it. The phrase became a slogan, not a practice. But there were also serious engagements with Lee's work. Martial artists studied his training methods and incorporated his ideas into their own systems. Filmmakers analyzed his choreography and editing techniques. Philosophers examined his synthesis of Eastern and Western thought. These communities treated Lee as a legitimate thinker, not just an entertainer. The question of Lee's intellectual legacy is complicated by the fact that he never published a formal book. His writings were scattered and unfinished. After his death, Linda worked with editor John Little to compile and publish Lee's notes. The result was a series of books, including The Tao of Jeet Kune Do and Bruce Lee, Artist of Life. These volumes preserved his ideas but also codified them in ways Lee might have resisted. Lee's son, Brandon, inherited his father's physical presence and some of his intensity. He pursued an acting career and landed the lead role in The Crow, a dark fantasy film released in 1994. During filming, Brandon was killed in an on-set accident involving a prop gun. He was 28 years old. The coincidence of both father and son dying young, at the height of their careers, deepened the mythology around the Lee family. Some interpreted it as tragedy, others saw it as eerie pattern. The tabloid speculation was relentless. Shannon Lee, Bruce's daughter, chose a different path. She became a martial artist and actress, but focused much of her energy on managing her father's estate and preserving his legacy. She founded the Bruce Lee Foundation, which promotes his philosophy and funds scholarships for martial arts students. She has been a vocal critic of portrayals that reduce her father to stereotype. The legacy Bruce Lee left behind is layered. He is remembered as a martial artist, a film star, a philosopher, a cultural symbol, and a tragic figure. Each memory is partial. Each emphasizes different aspects of his life. The challenge is that Lee's life was cut short. He didn't have time to clarify his ideas or correct the misunderstandings. He didn't have the chance to grow old, to make mistakes, to evolve. What remains is a snapshot, a man at the peak of his powers, frozen in time. The question his afterlife raises: does dying young preserve a legacy or prevent it from becoming something more? Bruce Lee's gravestone in Seattle is simple. It lists his name, his birth and death dates, and a short inscription: "Your inspiration continues to guide us toward our personal liberation." Next to it is Brandon's grave. The stones are close but separate. Visitors leave offerings, flowers, coins, handwritten notes. Some leave nunchaku or photographs. The site has become a pilgrimage destination for martial artists from around the world. They come to pay respects, to take photos, to stand in silence. The question visitors bring with them is the same question Lee asked himself. What does it mean to live fully? Lee's answer, pieced together from his writings and interviews, was that living fully required honesty. Not the polite honesty of social etiquette, but the deeper honesty of confronting your limitations and working to overcome them. He believed that most people avoided this work because it was painful. But Lee's life also showed the cost of that approach. He pushed himself relentlessly. He ignored warning signs. He treated his body as a machine that could be optimized without limit. The result was a legacy of extraordinary achievement and a life cut short. The defenders of Lee's legacy argue that he accomplished more in 32 years than most people do in 80. He transformed martial arts cinema. He introduced millions to Eastern philosophy. He opened doors for Asian actors and martial artists. He created a body of work that continues to inspire. The critics argue that Lee's obsession with perfection made him vulnerable. He prioritized legacy over health. He measured his worth by his ability to perform. He could not accept slowing down, even when his body demanded it. The result was tragic, but not surprising. Both perspectives are true. Lee was extraordinary, and his drive was both the source of his success and the cause of his downfall. His influence on martial arts is undeniable. Before Lee, martial arts in the West were largely confined to insular communities. Styles were taught as closed systems. Practitioners were discouraged from cross-training. Lee's advocacy for openness and synthesis accelerated the development of mixed martial arts, which emerged decades later as a direct descendant of his philosophy. His influence on cinema is harder to quantify. Lee made only 4 complete films as a leading man, but those films established visual and narrative templates that action filmmakers still reference. The Hong Kong film industry built an empire on martial arts cinema. Hollywood eventually embraced Asian action stars, though it took decades and the path was uneven. His influence on popular philosophy is the most contested. Be water is ubiquitous. But how many people engage with the ideas behind it? Lee wanted people to think critically, to question systems, to adapt. But slogans are easier to consume than discipline. The ultimate measure of Lee's life is not what he achieved, but what he tried to achieve. He wanted to prove that an Asian actor could be a leading man in Hollywood. He succeeded posthumously, but not in time to see it. He wanted to create a martial arts system that was open, adaptive, and rooted in inquiry. He succeeded, but the system has been codified in ways that contradict its premise. He wanted to be remembered as more than a fighter. He succeeded, but the image the world holds of him is still dominated by his physical presence. Bruce Lee's life was not a cautionary tale or a triumph. It was both. He was ambitious, disciplined, and visionary. He was also stubborn, exhausted, and human. He pushed boundaries and paid the price. He opened doors but didn't live to walk through them. The question that remains, the one visitors bring to his grave, is not who Bruce Lee was, but what his life means now. And the answer, like water, depends on the container. A wooden training dummy stands silent in a Hong Kong studio. The windows are dark. On a nearby desk sits an unfinished script titled Game of Death. The ink on the final page is still wet. Bruce Lee was born in the year of the dragon, in the hour of the dragon. In Chinese astrology, this combination is considered powerful but unstable, driven by ambition, prone to burnout. It's a detail that means nothing, or everything, depending on how you look at it. What is certain is that Lee lived as if time was short. He trained obsessively, worked constantly, and measured his worth by his output. He wanted to leave something that would last. He succeeded, though not in the way he imagined. His films are still watched. His philosophy is still quoted. His name is still recognized by people who were born decades after his death. That is a kind of immortality. But it is also a flattening, a life reduced to highlights, a person reduced to symbol. The people who knew him, Linda, his students, his colleagues, remember someone more complicated. They remember the hours of practice, the frustration when a technique didn't work, the laughter at small jokes. They remember a man who was brilliant and insecure, generous and impatient, visionary and exhausted. They remember someone who wanted to be remembered, but who didn't have time to decide what for. Bruce Lee died on July 20th, 1973. He was 32 years old. The question he left unanswered, the one he asked in his notebooks and in his films and in his philosophy, was this: can you adapt to everything? Or are there limits even water cannot cross? The answer, like most things about his life, is unfinished.